Now I mentioned before that, in the 90s, when we first started doing overdubbing and using drum machines and doing instruments one at a time, I thought it was really kind of inferior. It was never nearly as good as live. But once the tools got better and people got better at using them, they began to vary them and use them as tools. And people use loops today and samples in very creative ways. And singers are unbelievable. Singers who make vocals up out of dozens and dozens of performances and put it together in ways, and combining it is part of their creativity. And so we were in a totally different realm. Seeing stuff live is still, and recording it live is still its own amazing thing that is immersive, but we have passed the Rubicon. It used to be, there's a cliche about, somebody would play you a string sample. They would say you something they did with a string sample and say, doesn't that sound like real strings? And I would say, yes, it sounds exactly like real strings, but you can only do certain kinds of melodies with string samples. You can't take a written piece of music and play that and add like glissandos or spiccato, right? It will not do that. So you have to take a sampled instrument as something different. You can't use it as an imitation of the real instrument. You can if you're just doing pads. If you're doing pads of string chords, it can sound just like real strings. Just like sampled drums can sound a lot like real drums. And loops obviously are recordings of real drums. And so we are in a world now where the creativity has absolutely exploded. It used to be that in order to learn an instrument, you had to have enough money, your family had enough money, and you had to have the resources to hire a teacher, whether it was a piano teacher or a guitar teacher. And the number of people who could learn instruments was very limited. Now, you can learn instruments over the internet. Anybody, if you can find an instrument, you can learn to play it. There's a guy named Usman Riaz, who I met through Ralph Simon, who's a dear friend, who lives in London. And Usman grew up as a classical pianist in Pakistan. And he taught himself to play this sort of hammer style of guitar on your lap, where you play it, where you fret it with your fingers and you hammer it. And he got really good at it. He learned it totally off the internet. He became a TED Fellow, doing concerts, doing this. And he got a complete scholarship to Berkeley because he had taught himself to learn to play. And so now, the number of musicians and the quality of musicianship is so unbelievable. Even pitch. Musicians now can have feedback. Guitar players have, you can look at a strobe and see if you're singing in tune. When we started playing with click tracks, drummers always felt terrible when they played with a click track, with the exception of Steve Gadd, who was amazing. So I remember you'd be cutting a track, and if you had a click track on a track he was cutting, he would basically listen to it and nod his head, go, okay, that guy's time is okay. And then he would, I don't have to worry about him. And the other thing that he did that was amazing is he would count off, usually when drummers would play with a click track, and you'd be going click, 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 and they'd be going 1, 2, 3. Steve didn't do that. Steve would put the clicks on the upbeats so that you would hear it all the time. So you'd be like, 1. And so it was easy to stay in time, because when you're playing with the click on the beat, if you're right on it, you don't hear the click because you nailed it. By the time you hear the click, that means you missed, and now you have to compensate. Steve was just brilliant. He was just, there must be books written about Steve, so he was unbelievable. Well, I was originally, when I was in high school, I was very good at math. And when I went to college, originally I was going to be an engineering major. So that's what I wanted to do. That was my first major. And then what happened is I was playing in bands, and we would play clubs till 3 in the morning, and then there'd be an after show party, whatever, we'd go to someone's house. And I would get back to school at 9 a.m. And then I'd have a physics class, a lecture with 200 kids in a giant lecture hall, and I would just fall asleep. I was like, okay. And so I dropped out in the first semester. But I was always, I always loved engineering. It was just a natural for me. And so when I stopped producing records, what happened is it got to be less fun producing records. When you're working with superstars and they're brilliant and the performance on the other side of the glass is incredible, there's no higher than that. when you're still making good money, being paid big advances to do tier 2 bands that will never be amazing. No matter how good you are, no matter how great the arrangement is, they're just not as amazing, then you start to lose interest. And so I was rehearsing a band in Sacramento, and when you're rehearsing a band, they can only spend about 4 hours a day rehearsing with you before their head starts to explode. And I remember one of the first things that I did with this band was they were all playing too much. And so there's this idea that you think you have to play all the time. And so I said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to play the song, but no one's allowed to play more than one note every other bar. And don't play it on the downbeat, you just have to play it. So you have to understand that the song starts here and it ends there, and the time moves forward whether you play a note or not. And so you play only the notes that you need. So I had to teach them to play less, which is a good lesson in the studio. The other lesson in the studio is that bands, and there are some famous bands, I won't mention the name because I don't want to be unfair to the people, where they think that the person with the most musical education should call all the shots. But they often have the worst taste. This particular band I'm thinking of, the singer went on to be very famous and was obviously the star, but when they were first rehearsing, like, she didn't get a vote. She was like, no, she's just the singer, she's not. And so you have to teach people to be at the highest level and listen to what's great. And the thing about Jerry Wexler that made him so amazing, and Tom and Arif, was picking the songs, knowing a great song and a great performance. All that matters. There's a cliche that the song is more important than the singer, which is more important than the microphone, which is more important than the console, which is more important than the tape recorder. So the closer you get to the original creative process, the more valuable it is. And the best producers are psychologists. How you get the greatest performance from somebody, you don't get the greatest performance. You don't inhibit the greatest performance. They shouldn't be there in the studio unless they have the greatness in them. And if they do, your job is to stop the things that stop it from flowing. You need to get the creative juices flowing. You need to stimulate them. When we first made the drum loop, so it's like technology is a stimulus in the beginning and then it gets boring. So Bach created the well-tempered clavier because it was the first time that you could play the same instrument in all 12 keys because they had well-temperament. And so it was a stimulus to him that he could write 12 fugues and 12 preludes, all for the piano, for the clavier, that could be played on the same instrument. It was a stimulus for him. When we first came up with the drum loop, it was incredibly stimulating. The idea that we could make records using drum loops freed us. We could do instruments, one instrument at a time. We used that same drum loop from Stayin' Alive on More Than a Woman and on Woman in Love by Barbra Streisand. Sometimes a drum loop just works. And so new technology is a stimulus, and the new technologies of sampling and vocorders and pitch correction and all these things, they start off and you may use them, you can use them just to fix things, but they're best when they stimulate you to do creative things that you wouldn't have done otherwise. So getting into the music business is different from being an artist. So there are two different paths. Getting into the music business, you need to learn about marketing and how things go and how it works and how artists get signed, and hopefully you can tell a hit song from a flop. It's about judgment and listening, and in the old days, A&R people would listen to bands all the time. Today, I think you are on TikTok all the time. You're following social media, you see what's going on. Being an artist is a different path. So I think to be a successful artist, you have to speak your truth. And then if your truth resonates with an audience, you will be successful. So there is a feeling that I have that all the great successes have been artists who they give voice to someone who didn't have a voice. So the Beatles gave voice to adolescents. Before this, teenagers didn't make music, young people didn't make music. There was no music made for them. Pop music was just pop music, and it was just standardized, and it was very But the Beatles gave voice to young people. They said things that you would never say in a song. They, you know, I need your love 8 days a week, whatever it is, whatever they're doing. I want to hold your hand. Stuff that the adult generation was not resonating with. In the same way, Motown, Stax were speaking to a generation of black people who had only made records for white people before. It used to be race records that were sold with black artists who sang black music were not even sold in the white record stores. There were some crossovers like Etta James, but mostly it was all very much whiteified. Stax and Motown gave voice to the need of the African American culture. Certainly Bob Marley gave voice to a bunch of people who were not represented, speaking their truth, not in Jamaica, but to a whole culture of people who thought that was relevant. I wondered for a while why Saturday Night Fever was so successful, and then I realized that what we did with that record, not intentionally, I was not as mature then as I am now, was we gave voice to working class people. People who had no one speaking for them, who just wanted to end their drudge work life all week, which they hated, and go out on the weekend and have a good time. And this was about, the movie spoke to that, and so it gave voice to them. Taylor Swift gives voice to young women. I heard this great interview, there's a podcast called The Times Daily with the New York Times, and I forget the name of the woman who was speaking. She was someone who was a Times reporter, and this was a story about Taylor Swift, and she was talking about Taylor Swift and how much it meant to her. And she said she had been at a newspaper before that, and she found out she was getting paid half what the men were getting paid. To her, Taylor Swift was like, she not only spoke to them musically, but she stuck it to the man. She said, no, you can't tell me I can't buy my masters. She gave voice to young women to say, you can take your power. We're no longer in a world where being physically stronger means that you have all the power. You can be mentally smarter. You can be more wily. You can be a better business person. You don't have to be a man. You can take your own power. And so this is, when you say to us, an artist, what are you going to do? You have to say, who do you speak for? And how do you represent them? Don't try to follow what's popular now and try to be the next Taylor Swift. You can't be the next Taylor Swift. There's only one Taylor Swift. There's only one Beyonce. There's only one Beatles. What you have to do is see who you represent and who you give voice to. And today, because distribution is international, it's totally global, if you speak for 10,000 people who share your views, whose voice you represent, they can find you and you can be successful. And out of 5 billion people in the world, probably 2 or 3 billion of them are online. It's pretty easy to get 1 million people to follow you if you have something to say that means something to them. You have to market it, you have to find them. It's not necessarily easy. Marketing is a big piece of it. But if you're trying to be a pop star by doing what's already been done, you can never be really successful. You can find someone to write to a hit song, you can do it, and maybe it can be like, bubblegum used to be in the 60s. It's only by being authentic will you really capture an audience. Well, they always say that tragedy plus time equals humor. So we were recording a Bee Gees track, and we thought, I think it was Love So Right, and we were recording the track, and we thought, well, this is probably really the good take, but let's do one more just to make sure we have it in the can. The assistant took the tape off the reel and put another tape back on, and we recorded it, and we listened to it back and said, this is not very good. And then we went to find the other tape, and we realized that he had taken the tape off and then turned it upside down, and we had recorded backwards back over the take we just did. Of course, as is always the case, if you lose something when you do it again, you don't stop till it's better. So we were inspired to do it better. So that's pretty funny in retrospect. At the time, it was terrifying. AI is an incredible tool. You'll be able to do all sorts of things. Certainly the idea of having your voice sung in another language with native colloquialisms is incredible. Using it as a tool, as a writer and stuff is incredible. My fervent hope for AI is, going back to stuff we were saying before, the most important thing for music is the connection between the creator and the listener. And as I mentioned, that's why I love to see bands live in clubs where they're playing, where you can experience this. And just creating a popular song, and again, we go back to what was said about connecting, speaking for people. It will be a long time before AI is able to determine an unrepresented mass sociologically, craft a song that's good for them and create it and speak to those people. And those people, again, will want to relate to the human that does it. And so the most successful stuff is listener to creator connection. And AI is a long way from being able to do that. It creates a lot of tools. The biggest problem I have with AI is that it seems to be eliminating apprenticeship. So if you worked at a film production house, it used to be the way you started was by doing coverage. So you would read scripts, you would write an overview of it, and that's how you learned about stuff. Well, now you have AI read the script and do an overview. It's like done. There's no way to apprentice into that. The same way for screenwriters. You have someone read a book, and you want to have them, do a temp script and see what it's like, and then it would take them 3 months or 2 months to do that. You would read it and say, make the second act a little bit longer and make the hero not quite so likable. And they would come back, and a month later you would have another one. Now you can feed a book to the AI, have it turn out a script and say, no, make the second act a little bit shorter and make the lead man not so likable. And then 60 seconds later you have another script to read. How do people learn? How do they get the apprentice jobs? The same thing happens with musicians. So the idea in AI that you don't have to be a musician, it's not just about creating the great music, it's about the love of playing music and creating with other people and being in the room with people and enjoying the creative process. And so for me, the problem we have with AI today is that the goals are not correct. The goals are to make things more efficient and to create things that generate more revenue, not to create more joy and comfort in people's lives. And if, when Facebook was using AI to optimize what things they send you to look at in Instagram or in Facebook, if they had set the AI to say, make the priority, increase engagement, make sure that you're not doing anything to harm young women emotionally, that you're not leading people down negative rat holes, they would have had a totally different result. The human brain is still our sort of neocortex from our reptilian brain, is still triggered to fight or flight. So if you hear a noise, you jump because that might be a lion. This is very deep in our brain. And so when you're on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, if something is more extreme, it engages you more. And so that increases engagement, which increased engagement means increased revenue. And so our goals for AI are just to increase revenue. If I'm a company and I can lay off half the workers by using machine, that's great. But how is that better for the planet as humanity? And it leads me to what I would call the green dichotomy. So Europe is generally much more, particularly now, much more green-centric and trying to save the planet and do things which are good for the life of the planet than America is. And America is very focused on success and getting ahead and inventing things. And so the safety net in Europe, generally medical care there's good, federally. In the United States, the medical care it's looking to be decimated even further, but there is no, national health care system. But when you look at global warming, there's no way that we will get ourselves out of the problem we're in by commuting with 2 people in our car instead of 1. That's not going to solve the problem. The problem is already much worse than that. The only way we will solve the problem is by inventing something that can really effectively recapture carbon and change the atmosphere. And that's going to be done by probably some immigrant into the United States who is absolutely competing because their family's survival depends on it. They won't eat unless they can become successful, and they're driven. They may not, when they're 45, ever be able to relax because they were nothing but stressed for the first 35 years of their life, but these people are the people who will invent our way out of this problem. And so my great hope for AI is that some people will focus on using it to improve mental health, and also that people will want to connect with local musicians, and that in 5 years there'll be a resurgence of local clubs, and you will go out at night and you'll hear bands, because just having music play in the background put together by a DJ or a playlist that Spotify creates, it's all very nice, and that's well, and it's terrific, but there's nothing as great as being with your friends and experience music live that's being created in front of your eyes. So my hope is that AI has a backlash from the music perspective, and people go, I want to hear live music from people playing in front of me. One of the best records that I ever made, and for some people it's like they go, we don't care about anything you did. We don't care that you played on Layla, we don't care that you produced Saturday Night Fever or Barbra Streisand's Guilty. The fact that you did Jellyfish puts you in the pantheon of the world. It's like you are brilliant. And so John Carter, who was the A&R person who signed Jellyfish, used to work for Atlantic Records. And Atlantic Records was going through a period of time where they were, as the record industry was changing, record labels used to sign bands when they were baby bands and give them a couple of albums to mature so they would get better and they would stay with them because they believed in them creatively. And when John went to his boss and said, I really think we should stick with this band, Jellyfish, I think they're really, really good. And his boss said, I don't think, they're right for this. And he said, well, maybe this is not the right label for me. And his boss said, well, I don't have to leave him my name, Doug Morris. Doug said, maybe it's not. And John was canned for believing in Jellyfish that ended up, for many people, making the greatest record ever made. So when we then went to Charisma, where they believed in them, and we made a couple of amazing records. And so for me, the saddest thing is the corporatization of record labels, where they went from the Mo Austins of the world, where they were, and the Lenny Warnekers, where they were signing bands because they believed in them. They were signing, the Joni Mitchells and all of the artists who were great, who they believed in, who Jackson Browne. They never thought that the first record, they weren't just trying to make commercial records, they were trying to make great records with the hope that if you make a great record, that it will connect with people and that you will make money. And those labels were successful, but they became corporatized. And so then they had to respond to their corporate overlords and say, well, what's our mid-year strategic plan? How much money will we make in 6 months? You need a record out by this date because your fans need it, and so you have to get it out in this time frame. Well, it's already possible, and some artists are doing it. I mean, I guess the classic example is Justin Bieber, who broke out himself. But then when you go to a major label, you have resources. One of the things that I guess I invented when I was at Universal Music Group was what became the 360 deal. The way it turned out was not the way I originally envisioned it, but the original idea was that you would say, you sign a big band, you give them a big advance, and you take a share of all the stuff, and that was the standard deal. But you could give them a menu of options and say, if you want us to do tour support, we take this royalty, and you get this much money. If you want us to do promotion, press and promotion, we do this. If you want us to do merchandising, do you sell your t-shirts and do this kind of stuff. So there's a whole sort of menu of options that you could do so that the deals would go from one end to the other. And so very successful artists, even back then, had what were called P&D deals, pressing distribution, where I would get a very high royalty rate, and all the record label did was they pressed and they distributed the records, because then you needed a distribution company to have the reach. Today, you don't need that. So today, depending upon how much leverage you have, you can negotiate with the labels to get totally different percentages. I'm sure that Taylor Swift's deal with Universal is much more favorable to her than some young band who is just signed, who has a chance to make a demo on their own dollar. Most recording artists would record for nothing if they could just pay their bills, because they do it because they love music. They are not necessarily, I mean, Taylor Swift is an exception. She was a good business person. I think her father's an accountant. So she's, she grew up in that universe, and she's very savvy. But many musicians, I mean, Andy Sturmer, who was the lead singer and the drummer in Jellyfish, said to me once, we were working on the second record, and the first record we did very inexpensively. The second record, the label loved them. We spent a lot of money, and we had already gone over budget, and Andy wanted to add a string quartet to one of the songs. And I said, I can't go back to the label and ask them for more money. They will shoot me. And Andy said, if this record is going to come out one note less than I think is perfectly satisfactory, I would rather work at McDonald's. This is the attitude of many musicians, many great musicians. You know, Bob Marley didn't get into music for the money. None of them, and you think of all the great artists over all the years, they were not driven by money. And so what you have now is you have an almost infinite supply of creators. So you have, whether it's CD Baby or DistroKid or whatever, anybody can create music. You have that same studio that I said before, the home equipment, digital recording, digital audio workstation that cost $250,000 in 1981, when $250,000 was a lot of money, much more than it is today. You get now for free with your Macintosh. You can have a digital audio workstation. Anybody can buy. You can work at McDonald's and you can save up enough money to buy a couple of decent microphones and some musical instruments and to record your own stuff. You can make recordings today. So now you have hundreds of millions of musicians who are making music, and you have the natural filtration process of Spotify. If people listen to it, if they like it, it goes viral. If they don't, it doesn't. So A&R is now a social problem, and it's strictly a matter of letting the society determine what's popular. Doesn't necessarily determine what's good, but how do you determine what good is? Well, the one overarching wish is that people would focus on emotional and mental health as a priority as opposed to economics. In the United States, once you earn, I think about maybe $65,000, $75,000 a year, which to some people seems like a lot of money, but once you earn that much money, making more money doesn't increase your happiness. If you earn $20,000 a year, for sure you're struggling and your life sucks. But once you can afford to live somewhere, to eat whenever you're hungry, to subscribe to services, listen to the music you want, watch the videos you want, happiness is no longer about finances, it's about your emotional well-being. And we don't teach emotional well-being. And hopefully as we have more of the feminization of our culture and less of a overly masculine, it used to be that when you were a woman, if you wanted a senior job, they would say, oh, she's acting like a man. She's too tough. She's a bitch. Whereas a guy does the same way. They say, yeah, he's a strong executive. It's like, once we get over that and we begin to care about people's emotional and mental health, that would be my first wish. My second wish is that we respect live music and appreciate it and have more engagement. I don't have a third wish. That my children and my family are happy and healthy.